just thinking about how you would build an agenda for understanding education through a complexity lens. And it starts really from my own interest within pedagogical research by arguing that really if we're going to define pedagogy, we need to see it as being the interpenetration of learning, teaching, curriculum and assessment. And I would argue that each of those four areas are complex adaptive systems within their own right. But it's actually where they come together that you begin to see the concept of pedagogy, that actually teaching makes no sense by itself. Traditionally, pedagogy has been seen as being the scientific study of teaching, but that makes no sense, because without teaching in relation to learning or teaching in relation to curriculum or assessment, particularly within formal settings, teaching of itself has absolutely no real meaning. So I would argue that right at the centre of a complexity approach is to see these four different complex adaptive systems as being interpenetrating, as linking in together. But actually where they intersect, we also need the teacher and the students in terms of bringing, if you like, the human element to this very complex adaptive system. So therefore I would talk in terms of complex pedagogy, if you like, in a sense. But one of the issues that you then have is that if pedagogy really is that complex, how does the individual teacher make sense of it? And therefore I would argue that another area that complexity can help with is understanding how teachers actually have emergent practice, how their practice changes over time and what drives that. And the sort of simple kind of model I'm working with at the moment is the idea that you've got almost, if you like, a triple loop learning system where as pedagogy takes place, as teaching and learning take place within the classroom, there's a level of information feedback to the individual. And one of the things they do is use a whole series of heuristics within the classroom. In other words, they're reacting very rapidly using lots of rules of thumb. And whereas Kahneman's work tends to see heuristics as being inherently inaccurate and poor, actually Gigerenz's work on fast and frugal heuristics would suggest that in complex social situations, ecological heuristics, fast and frugal heuristics actually can be extremely useful and actually really quite accurate in the way that they're used. And therefore those heuristics help us make second-to-second decisions. However, where those heuristics stop operating efficiently, or if a heuristic is used that doesn't give the desired outcome, then that can begin to change practice over time. People may try that heuristic several times, and if it's not working, almost at an experiential level, that information feedback will feed into the schema of the individual. And I would argue that every teacher has a schema of what they think pedagogy is, what they think teaching and learning is, that underlies is almost that sort of more stable, general, conceptual framework by which individuals are working. So the schema and the heuristics are working as a double loop learning system, but also the schema can be impacted not only by experience in the classroom, but engagement with theoretical models, evidence from outside of the classroom that can impact on the schema, and the schema can then change the kind of decision-making rules individuals are making to impact on heuristics. So pedagogy, the way teachers teach and the way that their practice emerges are a whole set of complex processes that the individual is involved in. So at one level, a complexity agenda for educational research might work at the level of the classroom and the level of the individual. But also I think it needs to operate at the level of the school, of the school community. How does pedagogy, how do the wider issues within the classroom relate to the wider community? How does the community work? How does leadership and management at different levels work, and therefore you're seeing yet more scales and yet more layers of complexity occurring within the educational setting that need to be taken into account. But as well as that, you've also got obviously how the school, how the people within the school community, how pedagogy and those involved, how those relate to the wider world. And obviously there are communities beyond the school, local communities. How does education hook into those local communities? How does education attempt to work with those local communities? But also communities beyond that, and the whole idea that those networks of processes and people, social, cultural and environmental issues all impact on things like policy making, which in turn result in things, for example, like changes in curricula that then link back and alter the way that the school communities work and teachers and students work. So if we're really beginning to try to think of a complexity agenda and a holistic way of thinking about that complexity agenda, then we need to start bringing together a whole series of different foci, because they all impact on one another, because they're all parts of open systems, they're all complex adaptive systems. And just to finish off with, whilst sort of beginning to think about the if you like, the complexity, the network nature of how we begin to research all of this, how we begin to understand it, how we begin to think of education, there's also the idea perhaps that what we actually need is a slightly different approach to research itself, one based on what I'm calling complex pragmatism, that actually our knowledge, our understanding comes from experience, comes from inquiry and experience, and then reflection and consideration of how we make sense of those inquiries and those experiences. And that means that we need to think about using a very wide spectrum of research approaches. We need to not begin to think there's only one particular way in which we can begin to explore some of these issues, but that we need to bring into play a whole series of different methods. It's that pragmatic idea of explaining why particular methods for particular research projects rather than others. Why are these things the most appropriate? And therefore, to a certain extent, you could almost sort of argue that it is bringing in an element of bricolage to the methodological approach. And that therefore what we need to be doing is perhaps thinking about using interdisciplinary teams. We certainly need to be thinking about working more as groups of researchers who are attempting to hold up different lenses, perhaps to common processes, different lenses across a series of processes, but always trying to understand at quite a practical level what the implications of what we're finding are, and how all of those various implications and insights come together to begin to give us a relatively networked idea of what's happening, but also trying to understand the complex nature of all the various dynamics and processes that are all going on at the same time. It's why I think that we need to start seeing this in more of a complexity orientated way, because actually what we can't do within all of these ideas is just isolate one variable at a time and pick on it, or begin to sort of use some kind of really reductive way of researching, because actually that then loses this sort of complexity, this interpenetrating nature of a whole series of factors which are all working at the same time and often in a non-linear way.